If you're like me, when you saw that video last month of the Black Hawk helicopter plowing into the American Airlines flight over Reagan National Airport, your heart dropped into your guts. 67 people died in the American Airline 5342 tragedy in Washington, but for the hundreds of grieving family members they leave behind, the nightmare was just beginning that night. And so too for the public information professionals who now face the impossible job of comforting and informing the public.
It was the middle of the night. The telephone rang, and I was told that something had happened with a plane. We weren't sure what it was, and that I needed to pack a bag, bring my passport, and get to the office as soon as possible.
Jennifer R. Hudson is not currently a spokesperson for any of the company's agencies or organizations that are still responding to the disaster in Washington, but she lived her own version of this hell 30 years ago, following the crash of another American jetliner, Flight 965, from Miami to Cali, Colombia. And her story offers some rare insights into what's happening behind the scenes right now, and lessons about empathy and transparency that we can all apply to our own professional practices. I'm Dusty Weiss from PodCamp Media, and this is Lead Balloon, a podcast about important stories from the worlds of PR, marketing, and branding, told by the well-meaning communications professionals who lived them. Thank you for tuning in. There is a lot we still don't know about the tragedy in D.C. And while some folks have rushed to place blame, investigations into these aviation accidents tend to take a really long time to play out. Look, there is an obvious mandate to determine with clear eyes and no agenda what caused this, so that we can prevent it from ever happening again. But the rush to place blame to fit the tragedy into a narrative steals something from those grieving families. It robs them of the space to grieve, of the purity of their anguish, of our collective appreciation for the scale of the loss before we all go back to spitting bile and consuming rage bait. There is a lost nobility in serving people in the depths of their grief, sacrificing your comfort or your agenda to give them what they need. And that's why I wanted to revisit this story. Today's episode is a remastered version of an episode that we released 4 years ago, but I feel like it is more relevant than ever today. So to set the stage, on December 20th, 1995, American Airlines Flight 965 from Miami crashed into the side of a mountain just minutes before it was expected to touch down in Colombia. 159 people died. 4 people and 1 dog survived. And just 3 weeks earlier, Jennifer Hudson had started a new job as American's corporate communications rep. She would go on to become vice president of communications for British Airways, and now has a practice in South Florida as an independent consultant. But in 1995, as the only Spanish-speaking spokesperson for the team, it fell to Jennifer to fly to Colombia in the dead of night and coordinate the company's PR response to the tragedy. And it is an experience that reshaped her as a professional and lives with her to this day.
Even just hearing you define that, like I have a physical reaction to it. I'm feeling something in my gut, in my stomach, like queasiness, just hearing you read that. I had graduated college and was trying to make the decision about whether or not I wanted to go to grad school or whether I should get a job. I was turning 21. I was going to migrate off my mother's insurance, and she was like, "You got to do something." And so I looked for work. I spoke Spanish because my undergraduate degree had been in Spanish. I had lived in Spain. American was hiring only Spanish-speaking reservations agents. And I'll tell you, Dusty, I didn't even type fast enough to get the job. So I actually taught myself to type. Did the interview, did the type test, and made it through. And I started an American Spanish reservations department. But the entire time that I was in the reservations department, I kept my hand in communications because I had a minor in communications. Kept my hand in communications. I had produced videos on the Spanish reservations department. I was a part of reorganization teams, the communications teams for those. I wrote the newsletter. And so I'd always kept my hand in communications and had actually finally made the decision to leave American after 3.5, 4 years to go to grad school because I knew I wanted to study public relations and work in that field. And an opportunity opened up in American's Corp Comm department, and I got the job.
Just a piece of good luck there, really, being able to make the transition that you did. But we also have a term in the PR and marketing field, and it's baptism by fire. And I imagine that making that transition when you did and moving over into that field kind of felt a little bit like that. I mean, what sort of training do they give you at a company like American Airlines to be a spokesperson for an aviation company? Are air disasters something that you're specifically trained to handle?
You know, my training for incidents happened in reservations, actually. I was also a part of what we called the IRG group, the initial response group, and I volunteered to be a part of that group. This was at the time when airlines contacted families after an incident happened, and the reservations agents, the IRG group, was responsible for that. So I had already had that type of training. By the time I got into corporate communications, I think I had probably worked 2 or 3 incidents with planes already, one of which was a fatal crash by an American Eagle plane, and I was a part of the initial response group when that happened.
But outside of that, there was no boot camp where they sent you to learn how to deal with a media scrum or something like that. It was.
There wasn't. And you know, I had taken communications courses in school, but yeah, the training that I got at American in Corp Comm was really just the seasoned professionals at American Airlines were the ones who taught me everything that I know. And working with them, how to deal with the media, what to say, what not to say. And companies like American Airlines always have crisis communications plans. And crisis communications plans become the Bible when you are involved in any sort of incident. And so, you know, I honestly, if I did receive some type of structured training, my memory is a little blurry about it, but I know that the crisis communications plan was something that I knew. I had the plan with me always. We would do what we had to serve on duty on the weekends. And that was back in the time when you had pagers and you'd take this humongous bag with you that had your crisis plan, all of the contacts, you know, there was no Google file or electronic file. So all that stuff was paper. So you would lug that home with you when you were on duty. And when you were the duty officer, you handled nonstop, round-the-clock phone calls from reporters, and you were the person who handled that, and you had your contacts within the company that you dealt with.
On December the 20th, 1995, American Airlines Flight 965 is preparing to depart Miami International Airport.
The 25-year-old Canadian TV series Mayday pulled together a pretty decent examination and reenactment of Flight 965's final hours. You can find it on YouTube if you go looking for it. But what sets this air disaster apart from so many others is that there was no big, huge mistake or failure that caused the crash. Instead, and somehow even scarier, it was a death by 1,000 cuts. A series of little issues, many of them mundane, that would have been fine under any other circumstances. But added together, it caused one of the top 70 deadliest air disasters of all time. On December 20th, 1995, Flight 965 was delayed by holiday congestion at the airports, and they were trying to make up time. A flight radar installation in Colombia had been blown up by terrorists several years prior, and so air traffic control in Cali couldn't see where the plane was as it approached the airport. Changing conditions on the ground prompted the pilots to try to reorient their approach to the airport, but they made a mistake with the autopilot and ended up, unbeknownst to them, pointed right at the northern Andes Mountains on a dark, moonless night.
Oh, baby. More.
I'd been on the job for 3 weeks, as you said.
In Dallas, it was a typical Wednesday night for American Airlines spokeswoman Jennifer Hudson.
I was at home asleep because it was the middle of the night. The telephone rang, and I was told that something had happened with a plane. We weren't sure what it was, and that I needed to pack a bag. I assumed conversations had already been had that I was a Spanish speaker in the department. I needed to pack a bag, bring my passport, and get to the office as soon as possible. And headed into the office with a mix of both just sort of shock and sadness and wonder, because I'd been in this department for such a short time, and I had seen what happens on the reservation side and the frenzy and the quick coordination that happens on reservations, but I had not seen it in corporate communications. So I remember walking into the department, and a lot of the other departments were dark, but the lights were on in our area, and I walk in and there's already tons of movement. And I head to the office of Al Becker, who had been with American and who I will just be forever grateful to. Al really calmed my spirit and told me exactly what I needed to do when we made the decision that I was the one who would head to Cali, Colombia. He brought me into his office, and I can remember him sitting back and telling me, okay, Jen, this is what you're going to do. Then you're going to do this. I needed to set up the go room for us in Cali. That room would be populated with fax machines. That's what we used back then, with fax machines and a computer for me to constantly churn out and receive information from corporate office that I would then need to provide to our country manager or to the media there. He was a man who had been around the curve a few times and had some sense of what I was going to experience. Although I don't think anyone really understood what I could experience unless you'd actually been there and seen it. I ended up on an airplane with our Go team, the only person from corporate communications. The plane ride down to Colombia was a little harrowing and nerve-wracking because we were on the same type of plane, 757. I remember there was some turbulence on the plane, and we were all trying to get some sleep before we headed down. And the plane was populated with all of the folks from American Airlines head office who needed to be there. Our operations person, insurance, like all of the whole Go team was headed down. And I remember that the plane, sort of shook a little bit, and it was a bit of turbulence, and we all sort of sat up, and people were running their fingers through their hair, and just a little sort of like, what's going on?
This was that same night of the crash? This was still in the darkness?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
This is still in the darkness.
So probably very, very early in the morning. Did you get any sleep on that flight?
I don't think so, because I remember being very exhausted in the hotel afterwards.
What, if anything, was going through your head on that flight?
I sat next to our insurance person who was going down, and we had nice conversation for a while, and I felt comforted, but I was still sort of racked with this sense of wonder and what the heck am I doing, 3 weeks on the job, in your 20s, young, not realizing. I will tell you this as a juxtaposition. Years later, working for British Airways, Colombia was part of my market. I was VP, as you said, of Latin America and the Caribbean. When I traveled to Colombia, we remained in the airport, and if we went outside the airport, we were in armored cars. Colombia is completely different today, right? But at the time, that was the reality of Colombia. I knew there were narcotraficantes in Colombia, but I didn't realize that the plane had gone down in an area that was populated by narcotraficantes. Ignorance was power at that time. If I had sort of known all of what I was going into, I might have been a lot more freaked out. But the fact that there was an incident with the plane was harrowing in and of itself, but I didn't have a full grasp of all of the political and social implications of what was happening at the time.
In Cali, family members of the passengers and crew waited in the airport terminal. Many of them had been waiting since the plane's scheduled arrival the evening prior, desperate for answers. And to the north, residents of Buga, a small mountain town at the base of the peak El Diluvio, reported hearing a massive explosion in the late night dark. But no one yet had any idea what had happened to the plane. As rescue crews began ascending the peak at 3 a.m., news reporters packed the already crowded airport terminal in Cali, joining the throng of people hungry for more information.
When I arrived at the airport, I remember walking through wide open glass doors and seeing the head of the country manager for Colombia surrounded by layer after layer after layer of reporters who were pounding him with questions. He had his head bent down. He was very humble. Obviously, it was a horrible situation. We're all in shock. He's trying to answer the questions calmly. And I realized that it was my job to go and rescue him.
To put yourself between him and those reporters.
Exactly. And I owe this to Al, because Al told me what I needed to do when I got there. You know, I'm sure that I was expecting a throng. I just don't know that I was expecting that much of a throng around this one individual. It was really sort of sad. You know, it's like this one man, he's surrounded by layers. It was like layers of an onion of people. It was massive. And so somehow I forced my way through the crowd, got to the country manager, and I might have said something like, we'll have a statement for you, whatever. And I pulled him out of that crowd, and we got to a room in the airport for privacy. And from that point, we ended up at a hotel near the site of the crash. And that's where I began to set up my operations room and everything that I would need with the support of some other folks at American. And so with the country manager's support, I was the go-between between corporate office and what was happening on the ground. You know, I spoke with my boss at the time later, and he said that you were our only eyes and ears there. And he also said something that I thought was really wonderful. He said, you know, we didn't realize until you got there and jumped into action how good you actually were until you got there and managed it. But you were our eyes and ears. We had no one else. He was spending his time in operations control. There was no one on the ground.
There's something to be said about that, though, because in a situation like that, when you're untested as you were, there's really no way to know until you have your feet on the ground. And from my experience, having been in high-intensity situations, although never quite that intense, sometimes you just have to keep your feet under you and just keep moving from one job to the next to the next. You just look at it like a to-do list. You almost, you don't look at it like it's reality until you've established some kind of order on it.
You know, you just put your head down and do the work. I had work to do. I had to get this room set up. Media around the world wanted answers. I just put my head down and did the work. Where that comes from, I mean, I guess that comes from the work ethic that your parents instilled in you. I don't know. I had already, been managing a team of over 100 people in the reservations department. I was used to having lots of information coming at me. It's interesting. It could have also been just youthful ignorance. There's always a moment after a crisis where there is a debrief, this kind of moment of reckoning where you have to kind of discuss and talk about. And I know that after that, there was some trauma that I experienced. But when you're in it, you're just dealing with it. And whatever I was experiencing was nothing compared to those parents who were waiting for their kids to come home for the holidays, for those families who were waiting for their loved ones. We actually set up places for the families in the hotel where I was staying. So I was seeing families while I was doing my work and coordinating with the country manager. And so seeing those families in their anguish, just, you don't think about self, right? I just did what I needed to do, and I knew that I needed to be the person who was gathering information as we got it, helping corporate fashion statements that reflected what we knew, because you can't tell what you don't know, and doing that in a way that protects everyone.
People from outside the industry, I think, forget that part of our job in public relations is to help bring information and ultimately bring closure to families that are having the worst day of their lives. And I know that it's easy sometimes to be seen as the bad guy when you're the face for a disaster for something like that, but I think that it's really admirable that you kind of kept yourself going by focusing on serving other people who were in need.
Yeah, and I didn't know this at the time because I hadn't gotten through my master's degree program in public relations, but the role of the PR person is really about serving that company and all of its various publics, right? There's a two-way responsibility that we have as public relations professionals to manage the interests ethically of all of the related parties.
Jennifer didn't know it at the time, but that mission of service was being tested in American Airlines corporate headquarters while she was afield in Colombia. And with flames still burning on the mountainside, a familiar tug of war was developing between the imperative for corporate transparency and the primeval instinct for self-preservation. But as more details trickled out in the days and weeks that followed,
hearing black box audio is one of the most difficult things ever. It makes, the hairs on your head and all over your body just stand on end.
It would become more apparent that the American Airlines pilots of Flight 965 bore the brunt of the blame, an uncomfortable truth to have to report to the world. The rest of Jennifer's tale coming up in a minute here on Lead Balloon.
This episode is brought to you by Global X. Since 2008, Global X ETFs has been committed to empowering investors with unexplored, intelligent solutions. Global X specializes in exchange-traded funds that offer exposure to the artificial intelligence ecosystem, including themes like data centers, robotics, semiconductors, and cloud computing. To learn more about Global X's entire suite of ETFs, from covered calls, fixed income, emerging markets, and more, visit globalxetfs.com.
Hey, it's Dusty. So, you like the show, I hope, at least enough to keep coming back. And hopefully it's because you've learned some stuff that you didn't know, or you've heard some great stories from interesting people, or maybe it's been helpful for your work as a professional communicator. But are you a Redditor? Because I know that Reddit is another great source for those sorts of insights. I would actually super appreciate it if you posted a link to this show on one of those Reddit threads where it's appropriate. Certainly only where it's appropriate. I would do it myself, but that's not really in the spirit of Reddit. But if there's an episode that you think a lot of other people would appreciate, you'd be doing me a huge favor as an indie podcaster, and you'd be helping other folks find this show too. So I know that there's only so many ways that I could say, please help me grow my audience without sounding monotonous, and I certainly get sick of it myself, but it's the reality of the medium I work in. So thanks, as always, for listening, and anything else that you can do to support us here at Lead Balloon.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This is Lead Balloon, and I'm Dusty Weiss. 3 weeks into her job as a spokeswoman for American Airlines in 1995, Jennifer R. Hudson was paged out of bed in the middle of the night and put on a 757 to Cali, Colombia. American Flight 965 was missing, presumed lost in the northern Andes, and as the resident Spanish speaker on the comms team, she was being sent to manage the company's on-site PR response. But at the same time, there was growing pushback from corporate headquarters in Dallas.
We had made an initial statement, and we knew that we needed to communicate more. I'm on a plane heading to Colombia, and I learned later that my colleagues are doing a back and forth with management where they're trying to convince them of the need to communicate more. Not that we shouldn't say anything at all, right? Management knew we needed to communicate, but as much as we were advising, they didn't want to do. And understandably so, because we didn't know anything. So why communicate when we don't know? And as you know, when you don't communicate, the void gets filled with something. So we were trying to convince them that we needed to fill that void.
I think this is probably something that plays out more often than most people realize behind the scenes in situations like this, not just at aviation companies, but any big corporate entity that faces a crisis, very often management's initial impulse is to just lock down, no information in, no information out. And one of the biggest hurdles that I think we face as public relations and crisis communicators is convincing them that that is not a good course of action. It's not good for the company and it's not good for the public. How do you, as a professional in this space, go about making that case?
It is so important for public relations professionals to be bold in their counsel with senior leaders. Because I mentor and train communications professionals to teach them how to do communications planning, I notice this lack of confidence even when they know that what they're saying is the right thing to do. There's a lack of confidence and boldness that we need to overcome, because there is no one more suited, more uniquely capable of approaching any number of different issues that companies face than PR people. And our role goes far beyond media relations. We need to constantly have our finger on the pulse of what's happening throughout the organization, in the marketplace, social, political, economic issues that can impact the brand. And we need to be taking that knowledge and information to senior leaders and providing them counsel and not shying away from that.
So when you left the U.S., you guys didn't know yet that the plane had crashed. You assumed that there was probably something terrible that had happened, but you really didn't know. And details began to come out very quickly then that morning as the Colombian military found the remains of the plane on the side of the mountain. What had happened? How did that change what your job was and how you went about doing it once you actually knew that the plane had gone down?
Well, emotionally, I was, severely impacted by it, obviously. But my role in CorpCom didn't necessarily change. My job was to help route information from what we knew on the ground through to corporate, fashion the statements, deliver that to media. I'm sure I was translating into Spanish, delivering that as well. And that didn't change no matter what. I mean, my memory of that time is in a closed room that I had in the hotel with fax machines, computers, and the occasional food item to eat. But I was heads down in there for the days that I was in Colombia. That's most, when I stepped outside of that space is when I saw the anguish in the families, or when I was headed up to my room. It's just, it was awful. It was awful.
While Jennifer coordinated American Airlines messaging, news began to trickle in from the mountainside of El Diluvio as well. Search crews had found the wreckage of the plane, as well as 5 survivors who were carried down the mountain on makeshift stretchers or airlifted to the hospital. Among them was Gonzalo Dusan.
When I get up of the fuselage of the plane, I remember my son. He say, "Father, Father, help me."
His wife did not survive the crash. His son survived the descent, but succumbed to his injuries in the hospital. Only Gonzalo, his daughter, and 2 unrelated young adults made it, along with a dog that had been stowed in a carrier in the cargo hold. Jennifer tells me that the dog came back to the U.S. and actually became the family pet of one member of the American Airlines critical incident team. But in that moment, in Jennifer's hotel room/command center, she was coordinating updates about these and other developments as search crews combed the mountainside, eventually locating the 757's black box voice and data recorders. The work was grueling, the situation heartrending. And with Christmas just a couple of days away, Jennifer was running on fumes.
I got a phone call that I was going to be going home, and that they were sending our Chicago representative to Colombia, who also, I don't think spoke Spanish, but by then I think we had enough of a handle on things. I remember that she walked through the door, and I just remember feeling this big relief that she was there. Mof walked through the door. That's what we called her. We called her Mof. And Mof walked through the door, just like, it was like sunshine coming through the door. And I think that we hugged, and I was very happy to have her there.
In the days that followed the crash, the industry was shocked.
Dave Simon is a retired pilot who knew the Kali approach well and told the Canadian TV series Mayday that the crash was baffling for investigators at first.
They were shocked because they didn't know how could a sophisticated airplane like the 757, flown by a well-respected international carrier like American Airlines with well-trained crews, get so far off course. Nobody could figure out how did it happen.
Only by combing through the flight data and cockpit recordings did investigators finally piece together the unlikely series of small errors that culminated in the disaster. The transcript of those cockpit recordings was made public, but the recordings themselves never were, though Jennifer and her colleagues heard them as they prepared the company's response to the investigation's findings.
There is nothing more traumatic or harrowing than listening to the black box audio of a plane that's gone down. I was in Al Becker's office, and all of us were sort of huddled around, and we were on one of those conference phones, and we were listening to the audio. It gives me chills to even think about it now, but I can still hear the whoop, whoop, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. I mean, I remember, that's one thing I remember so clearly. And then I remember silence. Yeah, hearing black box audio is one of the most difficult things ever, especially if it ends in the kind of crash that like we had in Colombia.
David Ivey was an NTSB investigator who spoke on the Canadian TV series Mayday.
This accident is known as a CFIT accident, which means controlled flight into terrain. By that I mean the airplane was controlled by the crew, and it was a perfectly normal functioning airplane, and the crew flew the airplane into the mountain. It's one of the leading causes of accidents over the last 100 years.
Two good pilots were led astray by a problem that they were trying to figure out, and at the time they failed to do the basic thing, fly the airplane.
A court eventually ruled that the pilots of Flight 965 had shown willful misconduct during the approach to Cali Airport. But regardless of who's to blame for a tragedy like this, it still leaves a mark. Not just on survivors, but first responders, investigators, and even the company spokespeople who live the trauma day in and day out in the course of their duties. Jennifer Hudson says there's no way to immerse yourself in someone else's grief like that and emerge unchanged.
After having been in Colombia and then knowing what those families had gone through, everything from arriving in the airport with a throng of reporters to finally hearing what those people on the plane experienced, what the pilots were listening to in their confusion or really just unknowing about what was going on. It was tough, Dusty. It was pretty traumatic. It makes, the hairs on your head and all over your body just stand on end.
You were sent down into this situation having been on the job for only 3 weeks. And so I know in the fields of public relations and crisis communications, there's sort of the, that person, they're the rookie mentality. A little bit of that goes around. But when you went down and went through this and then came back and saw your colleagues again, did they treat you differently for your having been through this?
I know that there was a great deal of empathy. I think I felt like I'd always been treated with respect, but I was definitely respected.
I think your story is especially interesting for comms professionals because a lot of people will work for 30 or 40 years in this career and never experience a situation that's anywhere close to as intense as what you did, with the stakes that high. And for me, it's always been kind of an important touchstone as my career has advanced to look back at the experiences you've been through. If you feel nervous before a pitch, you have a client who's upset, where you can at least sort of take a deep breath and remind yourself, well, at least no one's lives are on the line here. This is just a pitch. This is just an angry client. Are there times when you look at a situation that you have now and say, well, at least this isn't Colombia?
I don't really think of it in those terms,
You should try. It helps a lot.
Well, what I do, I mean, I don't think, at least this is in Colombia. I mean, it was almost 30 years ago now. What I've taken from it is the experience of being in that kind of traumatic situation. So much so that I don't get easily rattled. And I have to exercise a greater degree of empathy with clients who think they're in a crisis. You think this is a crisis. This ain't nothing. Who think they're in a crisis, and meet them where they are so that I can support them throughout. Issues management is different from a crisis. And in many cases, what I'm dealing with clients is issues management. My issues can rise to the level of a crisis if left untended and if you're not communicating through them and filling the void. But I don't know that I have experienced a true crisis of that magnitude. And even hearing you position it that way, that, you can work 30 or 40 years and not experience something like that, I'd never even really thought about that. It was just my experience. But yeah, I guess it is sort of unusual, isn't it?
You're one of the lucky ones, quote unquote.
And I think of it that way because it allows me to have this level of calm and focus in the situation that I think is very beneficial. Now, I might have a nervous breakdown and freak out afterwards, but when I'm in the moment, I'm dealing with the issue.
Following the crash of Flight 965, Jennifer stayed in the aviation sector for 7 more years. In 2004, she branched out as an independent strategic communications consultant in South Florida, which today has coalesced as her firm Think Beyond Public Relations. Among her areas of expertise, training and mentoring communications professionals so they can lead clients through messaging workshops that operationalize and align good PR practices with sound business strategy. She's a great follow on LinkedIn, so please do make sure that you're following her there, and we are so grateful to Jennifer that she shared her story with us. And thanks to you as well for tuning in. Here on Lead Balloon, we tell the stories of strategic communicators who do the impossible and everything that they learn in the process. So we hope to see you back here in this feed again sometime soon. Follow us in your favorite podcast app. Lead Balloon is produced by PodCamp Media, where we provide branded podcast production solutions for businesses. Our podcast studios are located in the heart of beautiful downtown Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We work with brands all over North America to help them launch and build podcasts that work. Check out our website at podcampmedia.com. Music for this episode by Allison Winter, Chelsea McGough, Craig Allen Fravel, Ender, Kevin Graham, Midnight Daydream, Moments, Solo, Stephen Keach, and True Genesis. And until the next time, folks, thanks for listening. I'm Dusty Weiss.